Welcome to Freedom Speaks. This is podcast number 12, where we talk about the freedom from slavery as the path for mankind. So it's a beautiful Tuesday morning in the Washington state, and beautiful sunny skies. It's so fantastic. Such great weather in September, and I hope you're having a lovely September for all those Virgo and all those Virgo energy out there. We just come through a new moon, which was pretty amazing. What I wanted to talk about today was something that has been on my mind for a long time, this whole concept. And obviously I've worked with it for many times, but I've never really gone into it in much detail or explored it. And so I wanted just to have a look at it today and have a conversation with you today around this one particular insight, I think, that is relevant for all of our lives, and particularly because of where we're at the moment within the world in terms of the problems of the world. And this is the insight. We cannot solve human problems with human consciousness. We cannot solve human problems using human consciousness. Now that brings up a whole range of different ways you can look at this. We could analyze what is human consciousness and what other consciousness am I talking about. But if you think of it just from a simple sort of scientific perspective, think of Einstein when he said that you cannot solve a problem using the thinking that gave rise to the problem. And a similar thing in quantum physics is like Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, that you can never measure the speed and velocity of any electron. You can only measure the speed, or you can measure the actual frequency of it. And the reason for that is because of the observer effect. Whenever you observe something, you actually you change what you're observing. So therefore, because we're creative beings, we have created the problems in our society, and now we try and unwind them using that same consciousness that created them in the first place. It doesn't work, because whatever we're observing, we are actually changing ourselves. Now, if our state of consciousness determines what we see in the world, well, then it's an anathema to try and think that we can solve problems from the same state of consciousness that we're in. It doesn't make sense. Now, that's on a macro level in terms of all the world's problems, but it's also on a micro level. It's in every single problem we have in our lives. And I've come up with this more and more, I guess, the more and more loving and more wise I've become in my lives, and the more open, and the more that my consciousness is raised throughout my own journey, I've come across this increasingly. Not that my problems are any bigger. We always have problems and we have struggles and stresses, and that's kind of what the nature of being a human being. So my problems haven't got any bigger, but I guess I've been called upon to apply a new response every time to those problems. Why? Well, because that new response is leading me obviously into a greater sense of my own true nature of my consciousness. So that's the kind of the universal plan for that. But let's try and make this a lot more practical and try and get a sense of how this works in our lives. Now, in economic theory, there's a theory called the Law of Unintended Consequences. And what that basically means is, it means that you have the best intention to try and get a certain outcome, but when you try and you put in place an intervention, that intervention then leads to further or different problems. So you might solve the immediate problem, but then you have now 10 other problems you have to solve. And then you need to try and have 10 different new interventions for those, which obviously then causes another 10 different problems. And now we have this exponential 10 times 10, 100 problems. And then it's 100 times 100, 1,000 problems. And so it moves forward like that. So the law of unintended consequences, and we can see that really much in our lives. So there are three types of the laws of unintended consequences, and three different types of how the consequences can actually be. Firstly, we can get a positive, unexpected good effect, say good luck from the consequences of our actions, or a negative, unanticipated bad effect in addition to what we was expecting. That's kind of what I will mostly talk about today, is that unanticipated. We didn't expect that this would be the result of what we did. Or a perverse, unforeseen effect, which is outside the scope or opposite to what was intended. So an unforeseen effect, perverse. So it could be exactly the thing that we're trying to sort out. We have the exact opposite actually occurring, which is unforeseen and perverse, like a boomerang. You throw the boomerang and you think, oh, it's beautiful, and it comes straight back and hits you on the head. Okay, so it's sort of like the boomerang effect of that. Well, why? Well, if we are the creators and we do create our consciousness, then obviously we need to shift that consciousness to change whatever we created. But if you look at it from a different perspective, it's almost like an eagle flying high in the sky, that the eagle has a much broader perspective of what's going on. And this brings us to the problem of the savior complex in society. As we start this incredible heart awakening and this opening to life that all of us are going through at this moment, whether we're resistant to that or not, we come across this thing where we suddenly have this incredible thing. I want to save the world. I want to save the world. I am here to save the world. Now, that might be very much true. We are all here to save the world, or to contribute to the world, or give our gift to the world. But as soon as you have that, and then that idea that you are the savior of the world, it creates a lot of unintended consequences. Why? Because firstly, you're trying to save it from your own human consciousness at that point in time. Now, there's a beautiful intended sense of it. I don't want us to feel unenthusiastic about trying to save the world. That's an incredible, beautiful thing to consider. But we're trying to save it from our own personal consciousness at that point in time. Whereas what's really happened to us, we've just finally awoken to the fact that we want to get out of our human consciousness. So what we're really saying is we need to save ourselves before we can start to save the world. The problem is if we don't have a bird's eye view, or the bigger perspective of what we are trying to save, then we don't see the full picture. We only see a tiny little microcosm of the macrocosm in our lives. So if you're thinking of your life now and something you want to change something in your life, well, you perhaps don't see the big picture of everything. If it's something like you want to save your marriage, for example, well, you might not be able to see from the consciousness that you have, or the perspective, you might not be able to see the whole bigger picture. The bigger picture could include many different dynamics. It could include, one, the sole purpose of both of you, which you're not aware of. You may not be aware of your sole purpose and how it links to your partner, or links not being with your partner. You don't know that. You might not know your partner's perspective. Psychologists always say that there are two different marriages. The marriage that you think you're in, the marriage that your partner thinks that he or she is in. So if we don't know really what's going through our partner, or what's happening with our partner at a deepest metaphysical level, because we really never really get to know each other at that deepest level, because that we don't really get to that deepest level from in our own self. So if you don't know what's happening with your partner, how do you know what is the right choice or set of actions to take? What is the right set of decisions? You might have this incredible intended consequence that you want to save the marriage, and therefore you create a whole set of interventions to save the marriage by, let's spend more time together, let's do this, let's do this, let's do this, let's do this. Now, if you take a little bit of science into that, that comes back to sort of Newtonian science, which says that for every action, there's an equal reaction. So the very thing that you try to do creates a force of energy moving out from you that radiates in a wave to your partner. In the example that I'm using, your partner now receives that wave of energy. If your partner's in a healing crisis and needs space for healing, that energy coming towards the partner is going to be resisted. The partner's going to say, no, I can't do that at the moment. I'm in a healing crisis. And the partner might push that energy back to you and resist you. Now you think, well, I've been rejected. And now the unintended consequences of your beautiful intention to save your marriage actually lets it fall apart, even gets worse. You start to drift apart from each other. And that's just one example. And there's many different examples. It could be in your career, the exact same thing. And so now this might be a little confusing at this point in time, because how do we work with this then if we have this unintended consequences? Well, let's just stay where we are now. First, one of the biggest things is if we don't see the bigger picture and the complexity of the entire world of what's going on, how will we know what is our contribution to the world? And what do we do? And how do we actually do that practically? Well, the first thing is we've got to give up the savior complex. We're not here to save the world as individuals. We have to contribute towards the world because we don't see the whole bigger picture. But we've got to tune into the aspect of us that does see the bigger picture. Now, that's an interesting thing, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. So to give you some sense of this, this is Niall Ferguson is he's a Harvard professor of history, and he talks some economics. He's got fantastic, really great stuff out there on the internet. If you want to ever look at, he's got a whole thing on the ascent of money, and he talks about money, and he's done many BBC series. This is his quote, and he says, "The law of unintended consequences is the only real law of history." So what he's saying is that human consciousness, which is is history. I guess history is the history of human consciousness, and the consequences of the actions of those humans who, with the best intentions, tried to create societies or tried to move forward or try to grow or try to meet a certain outcome, and then created a ripple effect that rippled into the whole of humanity and then changed various things. And perhaps those ripples came back like that boomerang effect. Some practical examples. Think of the First World War. First World War, the Russians, huge problem with Russia. I mean, with the Germans. The First World War has just been won. What happens in the Treaty of Versailles after the First World War? Well, they signed the Treaty of Versailles, which essentially wants they persecute or act like tyrants towards Germany and say, you've done all these horrible things, therefore we're going to persecute you. And essentially they bankrupt the German state. They put all these onerous conditions on Germany as a way of punishing the Germans, which actually creates eventually a lot of distrust, a lot of poverty, and the ripe conditions for a Second World War. Now, obviously, you need an intervention by Hitler, like a black magician or someone like that, to go in there and to utilize that, but they were ripe for that. They were ripe for that because of the way it was an unintended consequence of the Allies punishing. It's almost like if you punish your child and you're very punishing to your child, you might have an unintended consequence. The child might rebel or might withdraw from you. We need to be very careful around this in terms of understanding what are the choices of our actions and what they really mean. Intentionality is a beautiful thing in a spiritual path. We need to have that intentionality. But we need to try and also get to the higher picture so we can actually see the nature of all of what the bigger picture really is for our life. Now, in the law of unintended consequences in the First World War, they were warned. There was a South African general by the name of Jan Smuts, who was interesting. He was actually a general who had fought in the Boer War against the British. So he was a South African who fought against the British. And then when the British won that Boer War eventually, and they took it out, he became the Prime Minister of South Africa. And then he fought for the British against the Germans. Isn't history just crazy? But anyway, he said now he's this incredible field marshal. He's actually made a field marshal, and he fought the German campaign in Kenya and did extremely well in that German campaign. But he came out afterwards and he warned them. He said, you've got to be so careful. He said, don't do this. And you can read up all about this on the internet about his version of that. He's saying the Treaty of Versailles is too punishing. You're creating the right conditions for revolution, which obviously led to the Second World War. That's the law of unintended consequences. There are hundreds of examples in nature of how botanists, biologists, scientists have messed with the law of unintended consequences in nature, trying to fix certain problems, like we have an insect problem. So let's say we have sparrows in China was a problem. The sparrows were eating the grain. So the Chinese wanted to kill off all the sparrows in China. So they killed off all the sparrows in China, not realizing the sparrows actually ate a tiny little amount of grain. What they were doing is eating the insects which were eating the grain. So they found that after they had killed off all the sparrows, catching them in nets and other mechanisms, that what actually happened was the insects went up, population went through the roof, and it caused a loss of grain production. Think of all the insects that have come to America, for example, that are sitting in the forests in America that are causing huge problems with the trees in America. Well, what do? They then bring in other different animals to try and eat those, but those animals are not endemic here, and then they eventually start to kill off what they've been doing. So we have this law of unintended consequences that operates in nature in a huge way, because nature is this beautiful symbiotic relationship, and everything is in a flow, and everything's in this perfect harmony. And as soon as we start to mess with that, it creates unbelievable inharmony, because as human beings, we don't see the bigger picture of what nature is all about. So we have to be very, 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 very careful of that. It's almost like the introductions of rabbits in Australia. They introduced rabbits to cure off various populations, but the rabbits essentially ate all the ground, all the grass in Australia, and then they caused erosion. Now, when they introduced the rabbits, particularly to eat off certain plants they didn't want, well, what the unintended consequence was soil erosion. So we have this law of unintended consequences, which is the real law of history that operates in all of our lives. It also operates in our political spectrums. And if you think of now the politicians, say in Congress of America, in the Senate and in the House of Representatives, they are passing laws based on trying to solve solutions. But what is the consequences of that? Do they really understand the bigger picture? Are they in touch with a higher intelligence or some sort of idea to see the bigger picture, or are they just passing legislation? A very practical example of this is in economic theory. If you think of the nature of the crisis we had in 2008, which is the financial crisis of 2008. Now, with the financial crisis 2008 was largely brought on by the housing crisis. It was the reduction in the housing prices. The house prices dropped dramatically. People couldn't afford their mortgages. We had all these CDOs and junk bonds that were lended and etc. And we had this unbelievable banking crisis that then was the net effect of that, because they had so much bad debt on their portfolio. So banks were bankrupt. Well, what was the consequences of this? Well, in economic theory, they say that the reason for that actually started out when the Federal Reserve started to mess around with the economy back in 2000. And historians have actually plotted that back, that it was the interventions of the Federal Reserve in 2000 that actually led to the housing crisis in 2008. Now, what do we do when we have a crisis? Well, what lawmakers like to do when they have a crisis is to put more regulation in place. So the very sector of the economy that had the biggest financial crisis, which was the banking sector, was the most regulated sector out of all sectors. It was unbelievable regulations. They went from regulation, they said, well, banks, we've got to regulate the banks because of their practices and etc. And so they regulated them unbelievably, but that was the exact sector with the most amount of regulation that actually caused the financial crisis. So regulation in that way is an unintended consequence of regulation. Well, I know when I was the CEO of this American company that I used to work for, or used to run back in South Africa, I knew how regulation affected our business. We had so much regulation coming from head office of things we had to do, reportings and etc., because they wanted us to improve our results and they wanted to see the results continually. But that's so much of that intervention that they put into us when I was running that business meant that most of my time was actually doing all of this regulation, not actually growing the business and looking after the staff. That is an unintended consequences that came from head office. You know the old saying, one of the biggest lies you'll hear, I'm from head office, I've been sent to help you. You know, that's what, you know, when head office comes to you, you're in trouble. That's kind of the whole aspect of that. So we see unintended consequences operates in economics theory. In fact, we've had two major theories of economics, you know, the Keynesian economics and monetary policy, which has been the predominant way that the Federal Reserve and central banks have used to monitor the economies. Well, there's a third one that's come out, or a third whole economic theory called the Austrian School of Economics, which basically says it's the intervention in the economy by the regulators that causes the crashes. Remember, monetary policy is there to try and so that you don't actually have those huge swings and roundabouts. You know, this crash, we have depression and recessions, and then we have booms, and then we have recessions, trying to sort of flatten that curve. Interesting, flatten the curve. Look at the unintended consequences of trying to flatten the curve with COVID. We don't know the psychological damage that wearing face masks have on children, or the psychological damage, sorry, that's the physiological damage of wearing face masks. We don't know the lack of oxygen for people, for our beautiful children. Nor do we know the actual psychological aspect of separation, of children not being able to go to school or be able to play. Those might be far more reaching damaging effects that we don't know about. So We have to be so mindful of the law of unintended consequences for our own lives and for the bigger picture. Now, to give you a sense of how regulation can impact us from a personal perspective, think of this as a little easy story to understand. You have a problem with your wife. You and your wife are fighting a little bit, and you're starting to clash. And one day you come home and you see that the new neighbor's moved in next door, and he's this beautiful guy. He's this really strong, good-looking guy, and he's often out there in his shorts, and he's sweeping the pool, and he's cleaning his pool, and he just looks amazing. And you see your wife, when she's looking through the kitchen window while she's preparing dinner, and she's cutting all the vegetables, and she's looking out, you see her often gazing across at the neighbor next door. Now, your relationship's a little bit rocky. You're going through a little bit of rough time. So you think, well, okay, what do I do here? Well, you can apply regulation. You can say to your wife, okay, sorry, you may no longer cook in the kitchen, or I'm going to cover that window up in the kitchen, or you may no longer look across to your neighbor, or you might build a wall between you and your neighbor so that she can't look over the wall to see this gorgeous guy, cleaning his pool next door. That's kind of the unintended consequences of what she's going to rebel. She doesn't feel free. It's going to make the relationship worse. It's going to make her feel that you don't trust her. All of those aspects, or vice versa. So that's kind of regulation and how that would affect our relationships. Well, what is the problem in that? Well, the problem is that you don't have a good relationship with your wife, and you need to work on your relationship. That's the whole aspect of that. That's how you can potentially look at that problem. So that's not applying regulation on unintended consequences. That's really understanding the bigger picture of the relationship and having this bird's eye view of what's actually going on in your relationship and how you can solve that. So if you look at the law of unintended consequences, it works in all spheres of our world. And right now, at the beginning of the podcast, I said that we cannot apply human consciousness to solve human problems. That is the problem that we have at the moment, is that no one really sees the bigger picture of what's going on, the complexity of this world and the interrelated nature of it. When we had Donald Trump as our president, and he went into, and he had a trade war with the Chinese, well, the Chinese said, well, we're going to stop taking your trash, your plastic trash. So suddenly there was an unintended consequence. Now we had a buildup of trash. Well, there's another consequence that comes from that. Well, then we need to find and not be dependent on China, but we need to find a way to look after our own trash. So there's another consequence that comes from that. And so it flows on, and so it flows on. And the examples of the law of unintended consequences are massive. There's incredible, there's examples all over if you just research on the internet. So if we cannot solve human problems with human consciousness, what do we do? Where do we go? On a practical level, how do we look at the problems we have in our lives? How do we solve those problems? Now, I've struggled with this for a while from a number of different perspectives. For within my own self, if I look back at my life, is there one particular type of problem that keeps coming through, like a theme of problems? And if you look at your life, think of your life in terms of one theme that continually flows through your life. It might be a different problem, but the same theme that continually comes up. Generally, if you look at that theme, there'll be a number of different key points you'll be able to see from that theme that arises in our lives. The one will be is that when we have a problem, we either have two different ways of solving problems generally in human consciousness. We try and figure it out, strategize of how we're going to work this out, or we just try and hide from the problem and squash the problem and just, be like an ostrich and ostracize the problem and actually just cover it up and not deal with the problem. We just will treat the symptoms, not the real cause. That's kind of generally how we do it within our human consciousness. So when we're covering it up, obviously the problem is just going to arise in a different shape or form, continually arise, because it's sitting in our human consciousness. And if we are the creators of our reality, well, we're just going to continue re-experience that same problem that arises. When we try to solve the problem, try and figure it out, what we're trying to do in this case, we're trying to use our mind, our human consciousness which gave rise to the problem in the first place, generally, because most of our creation actually comes through from our minds, then into our emotions, and then into our physical body. And also from our memories that actually feed through that. So that's how we really are creating. We're creating with old memories, and then our minds and our thinking processes, which is our mental quadrant, and we think about that. Then we have the emotional response to that, and that then outpictures in a physical problem. That's how we actually, that's the creation spiral. The 9 steps, or that's the 4 steps of precipitation, as you would call it in mystical law. So if that's the way we're going through in terms of the creation of the problems, when we get to this mental quadrant, our minds, and we're trying to solve a problem, well, we're trying to strategize using the thinking that gave rise to the problem in the first place. Now, this is what's called a double bind in consciousness. It's a block in consciousness that you cannot solve. It can look like something like this. Let's say you have a problem in your job, and you're not really enjoying your job, but you have to be in that job from a financial perspective, from a money perspective. So here you have this problem. It's making you incredibly unhappy, but you don't enjoy the job, but you need the money for the job. So the double bind in consciousness that sits from a mental perspective would look like something like this. I cannot move forward in my life. I cannot be happy in my life until I leave my job. But if I leave my job, I cannot be happy because I won't have the money. So whichever way you look at the problem, there's no solution. There's a double bind in the mental conscious. If I do this, then that happens, but I don't want that. So therefore I can't do this. But if I don't do this, then I'll never be happy. So I'm not happy because I'm in my job. But if I leave my job, then I'll be unhappy because I'll have no money. So we think that's the way solution. So these double binds are not in consciousness that's created. Now, in a very strange way, I'll give you an analogy to that. I've been doing some yard work and I've been cutting up wood for the winter. You know, in the Pacific Northwest, you need lots of wood to cut for the winter. And when I cut these big logs of wood, you know, with a split axe and you split the wood, sometimes the wood is unbelievably easily split, and it splits in a dime and it just splits in 2. Sometimes I hit a knot in that wood. Not really, it's just a branch that's grown out of that tree as the tree has started to expand and grow. And in that knot of consciousness, the wood is unbelievably difficult to split. And I've actually broken one of my little splitting axes on that actual wood because it's so tough. Meanwhile, the wood just splits pretty easily without that knot. That is the same knots we have in our mental consciousness that holds us back from our lives. We have so many double binds of consciousness. I cannot do this because of that, and that then will bring me this. We cannot solve the problem using the exact same thinking that gave rise to that problem. So we have the law of unintended consequences, which is, or you could actually say in this case, the law of intended consequences, because you intended something to happen or not to happen by not taking action, but the result you get is the same, whichever way you look at it. So now we have these mental blocks that sit there, and we have these emotional blocks within our own physiology, which also don't allow us to move forward, because when we take a consequence, when we take steps, we don't like the way it makes us feel. And because we don't like the way it makes us feel, we don't want to take those steps. That's an emotional block that we have in our own consciousness, because we don't like to feel bad. Well, feeling bad is just a consequence of healing. It doesn't mean you're feeling, you don't like the feelings that happen when you're healing, but you're healing, you're growing. That's why that's what holds us back generally, is our negative, what we call negative or limited emotion. We don't want to feel those emotions, so we don't take those forward. So that would be an emotional block of consciousness for us that doesn't allow us to move forward. So if we can't solve human problems using human thinking, using human emotions, we have to rise above this. And if society is going to transform, and you know, when we talked in one of my podcasts, I talked about Arnold Toynbee, the study of history, when he talks about how amazing, he talks about that in order to change a civilization, you need a group of creative individuals or a creative minority who get inspired, who go within themselves and create an inspired solution in order to shift the civilization. So it was really that it required a group of minority of creative individuals who were inspired, who got inspiration in order to shift a civilization. And then they need, as new problems arrive in that civilization, you now need new creative responses to that continually in order to solve that. That was Arnold Toynbee, and it was a beautiful book written, you know, The Study of History, 3 million words, unbelievably long book. Not a book you want to read really in your spare time, but a fantastic book to read nevertheless. And I've just read the highlights of that book. So what Toynbee is saying that we need these creative individuals. Well, where does inspiration come from? Well, inspiration, it comes from the word inspiration. It's in spirit. Therefore, here is the whole nature of this. We need to rise above in our consciousness in order to be able to find the bigger picture of what is actually going on in our life and to understand the choices we make. We cannot make it from the limited consciousness, because continually throwing our beloved precious energy every day, trying to solve the same problems over and over again, is like being on a treadmill and expecting that you're actually going to see new sights. It's the law of insanity. Trying the same thing and expecting a different result. What that really means is trying the same level, bringing the same level of consciousness gave rise to the problem to solve that problem. The same level of emotional consciousness that gave rise to that problem to solve that problem. Or trying the same physical perspiration, like I remember when I used to play hockey and our team was losing, what I would do is I would just work harder. That was my solution. I would work harder. I just said, okay, well, obviously the only thing I can do now is to work harder. That was my default, to go into my physicality, to work harder and harder and harder to try and solve it. Or maybe your default is when things go wrong is to think more and more and more and more about the problem. Or maybe it's to ignore your emotions, just to shut the negative emotions off. Maybe that's how you do your problems. And what I learned really was when I was playing hockey and our team was losing, was to stand back and to look at the bigger picture and say, why are we losing? What is going on here? What is the bigger picture of this? Where is their strengths? Where are our weaknesses? What are we not doing here, and etc. And to work smarter, more efficiently. That was bringing a higher level of consciousness to that particular situation. That can be applied very practically to every aspect of our lives. If you have a problem in your life right now, that's something that you've not been able to solve, not being able to sort out, then you need to rise into a higher level of consciousness. Now, here is the trap about thinking about rising to a higher level of consciousness. And there's two traps here. The first trap that we have is we can't rise to a higher level of consciousness if we are sitting in the problem consciousness, if we're continually thinking about the problem. That's difficult to do. It's very difficult when you have a really big crisis in your life to actually spend time. It's almost the last thing you want to do is to be quiet and go within, because you think we just go around in this fruitless energy by just expending energy, thinking about it, worrying about it, moving forward, and it doesn't take us anywhere. We've got to pull back at that point in time and actually go, okay, but that's the hardest thing to do. And that's that first trap that we feel, is trying to really be present to what's going on and escape that. That would be the inward solution, which then would provide the outward answer. The second trap we have in rising in our consciousness is the surrender trap, or the resistance trap, or my will trap, or my way. That is, we try and rise to a higher level of consciousness, but we don't actually offer up our own actions. We don't really say, well, okay, I realize that I'm responsible for this, I'm the creator of this, and that I am going to give up all the outcomes that I think I want from this. We don't do that. We don't surrender completely to that higher level of consciousness we are. And if we don't surrender completely, well, we're not going to get into that higher level of consciousness. We've got to surrender. Now, surrender doesn't mean that we're surrendering to some sort of deity sitting on a rock there who's lording over us and saying, you've done terrible things. And that's not what I mean by surrender. Surrender is surrendering to allowing the problem to be solved by withdrawing your energy problem and giving the problem to the aspect of ourselves, which is already in that higher consciousness, being our higher self. It's surrendering the problem to that higher self and saying, you take charge of this, you show me what to do. You show me the way to take. What is the right thing to do here? And then allowing the space to move us back into flow. Anytime we have a problem in life is because we're not in flow. There's not a flow that's coming through us that allows, because life is meant to be a flow. And the law of unintended consequences works because we then try and create an action which creates that resistance. I talked about that with, Newtonian. For every action, there's an opposite equal reaction. That resistance that builds, that's simply the resistance that comes back to us. So we need to let go of all of that burdens to the higher self within us. And then we need to watch ourselves, because generally what happens is we let go and then we start to think about it again. And then we start to say, well, okay, I'm going to make a bargain with you, higher self. Or maybe you think of God, or the projection of God, this deity on the rock. Maybe they have this conversation. Well, I'm going to let this problem go to you, but I only let this go to you if it fits this outcomes. Now, if you think of yourself as a parent to a child, you see the bigger picture for the child much more than the child sees. The child doesn't see the bigger picture of its life growing up. It doesn't have the wisdom and experience that you do, that we do as parents. We have the wisdom and experience, therefore we make choices. The child can scream and shout about those choices and be very unhappy about those choices. But we know in the long run, that is the most beneficial thing for our beautiful children. It's the same thing for our higher self. We might scream and shout when we surrender. No, but I don't want this problem. Don't give me this on. Don't give me this solution. I don't want that. I don't want that to happen. Well, maybe that's the thing that we need most in our life, to bring us, to confront us with the real aspect of us that created the problem in the first place, might be one of the outcomes. In fact, that generally is the outcome we get in our lives. We get to force to take responsibility for what is actually within us that created that in the first place. In terms of that surrender, we are pretty disobedient to ourselves. We believe that surrender is a sacrifice, that every time we surrender, we're sacrificing someone. What are we really sacrificing when we surrender in this instance? We're sacrificing our problems. We're sacrificing being unhappy. We think we're going to be unhappy when we surrender our problems. Well, we're unhappy already. That's the funniest things. We're unhappy because we have so many problems and we can't solve them, or we continually have the same problem that arises all the time. That's just so, you've got to bring a little humor to that. It's quite funny if you think of it, how crazy we are and how much wasted time and space. I know in my own life how much wasted time and space I've used trying to solve my problems continually, just by the same thing, consciousness that I've brought to those problems. So that's the second trap that we have. We surrender, but we surrender within a bargain. I'm only going to do this if I get this. That's a compromise. Compromises are not flow. If we're compromising in our relationships or compromising in our work, we're compromising ourselves. That is a betrayal in any sense or shape of the form. We betray ourselves. We betray ourselves and blame others for our betrayals. That's generally what we do as human beings. We believe it's our partners who betray us, and no, it's not. We betray us. We are the betrayers of ourselves. And that's quite a big thing to bring in. That doesn't make us feel great. If you think of that now, how much we've betrayed ourselves. We betray ourselves in giving away our power to relationships that don't serve us, or doing jobs that don't really fill us with joy. We betray ourselves in the way that we interact with our fellow human beings, where we short sell ourselves, where we don't believe that we can do the most magnificent and magnanimous things in our lives and the nobility that we truly have. We are really a betrayed society because we've betrayed ourselves first and foremost. And that's not a judgment, it's just a sense of the truth, or my truth anyway, which I believe that, for society, that's what we do. So the law of unintended consequences. What this means for us is we cannot solve the human problems. We have ginormous human problems. We have the problems of COVID and the problems of poverty, the problems of economics, the problems of finance, the problems of poverty. We have the problems of businesses. But we are continually trying to find short-term solutions. Like right now in America, what's uppermost in my mind is the rise of socialism, and how that we need to solve the economic problems of socialism because capitalism doesn't work. And I'm going to do a whole podcast on that. Well, it's not so much that capitalism doesn't work. It's not so much that doesn't work. It's more the problems of monopolistic capitalism that doesn't work. Remember, and I think I'll leave that for a different podcast, because that's a whole topic in itself. But I'm so mindful at the moment of all of the problems that I see or the solutions that I see coming from the lawmakers, the politicians, from the regulators, not really seeing the bigger picture, but only one portion of it. Like with this COVID pandemic, we don't really see the bigger picture of it. We need to get not just a Fauci, who might be a guy who understands somewhat about, the medical science around it. We need to get scientists, sociologists, psychologists, educationalists, economists. We need to get all of them into a room, all putting their aspect of what they see as the real problem that they see, and put that all together, and the politicians all together, to try and solve the problems collectively, because each of us has one aspect of the solution for the problems of this world. We have one solution, one gift, one amazing contribution that we can make to this world. And therein lies the fact that we need to be in community together in order to put those gifts together, that we can make this beautiful tapestry or this puzzle with our own consciousness, with our own gift that we bring. We need a collective solutions, but it requires the individual genius within the collective solutions cooperating, connecting, communicating together in order to solve the problems of this world. So let's rise above our human consciousness. Let's rise above. And if you want to know how to rise above, I've given you some very basic examples. Well, we've got a whole system of transformation, that myself and my wife run within our business. That's one way, but there's many different teachers out there will help you to rise above in your own consciousness, that you can only rise above to the higher self within yourself and find that bird's eye perspective, that eagle perspective, see the outcome that you want, see where you're going, and then make powerful choices in your life with the full intention and the full understanding of the consequences of your choices and the full responsibility for those choices. It's been wonderful spending time with you. And thank you so much for attending this podcast. And thanks so much for all of you guys on YouTube. And please text me write me a letter or email me if you want to have a great conversation about any of the topics we talk about in Freedom. My email address is michaelrahl59@gmail.com. That's michaelrahl59@gmail.com. I wish you so much love and blessings on your journey. May you rise to your higher self every day. May all your problems fall away, and may you know the bliss and the serenity and the peace of your true higher self. God bless you. Thank you.